The road to Crowbridge was more desolate than Elena had remembered. Fog curled up from the earth, a thick, living thing that clung to the landscape like it had been waiting for her return. Every mile carried her deeper into a gray, forgotten world where time seemed to slow and the air itself grew heavy with damp. It had been years since she had set foot in this town, and yet, as the car creaked down the winding road, the familiarity of it settled into her bones like a chill she couldn't shake. The village appeared just as she remembered it, a small, crumbling place lost in time. Barely a handful of buildings, all weather-beaten and bleached of color, huddled together as though trying to stave off the inevitable encroachment of the wilderness. No one lingered outside. There were no signs of life save for a single dog, mangy and old, skulking in the shadows of a half-collapsed barn. It lifted its head to watch Elena's car pass, but made no move to approach, as if it knew better than to greet strangers. Raven House waited at the end of the village, perched high on a lonely hill like a sentinel overlooking the fog-choked land. The sight of it sent a shiver racing down Elena's spine. The mansion had always seemed more fortress than home, a looming structure of dark stone, its many windows black and empty, like the soulless eyes of a creature that had been dead for too long. The ivy that once crept up its walls in delicate tendrils had now grown wild and invasive, choking the stone in a web of green and brown. The house had aged, but it had not decayed. If anything, it seemed more imposing, as though the years had only deepened its malevolence. She parked at the foot of the driveway, staring up at the house with a growing sense of unease. Memories flickered at the edges of her mind, fleeting images of shadowed corridors, the echo of distant whispers, and the cold, bitter smell of rain-soaked wood. She had only visited a handful of times as a child, but the house had left its mark on her, one that had never truly faded. Her aunt had lived here alone for decades. The old woman had always been an enigma to Elena, her mother's estranged sister, a presence as distant and cold as the house itself. Letters had been rare, visits even rarer. Her aunt had never been kind, not exactly, but she had been present. A looming figure in Elena's peripheral vision, shrouded in the mystery of the house. Elena had heard the news of her death a month ago, delivered in a terse phone call from the town's sole lawyer. No one had found her body immediately. She had simply slipped away, alone in the shadowed halls of Raven House. The townspeople had been reluctant to enter the mansion, only doing so once the stench had become unbearable. The details were sparse, but the implication was clear. Her aunt had died as she had lived, isolated, forgotten, and surrounded by something no one wanted to name. Now it was up to Elena to settle the estate. The very thought of it filled her with dread, but there was no one else left in the family. The lawyer had been insistent, his tone as cold as the fog curling outside her window. "The house is yours now." She stepped out of the car and slung her bag over her shoulder, her breath catching in the icy air. As she made her way up the uneven path toward the house, she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. The windows, dark and lifeless, seemed to watch her every step, tracking her approach. The front door loomed ahead, a massive slab of oak that had weathered decades of storms, but still stood tall, unyielding. Elena hesitated for a moment before reaching for the key. Her fingers trembled as they grazed the cold metal, and she cursed herself for it. This was ridiculous. It was just a house. Just an empty old house. The door creaked open with a groan that seemed too loud in the thick silence. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of dust and decay. She stepped over the threshold and felt an immediate drop in temperature, as if the house itself had sucked the warmth from her body. The entryway was as grand and imposing as she remembered. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, a sweeping staircase that led to the upper floors. But everything was draped in shadow, the corners swallowed by darkness. The silence was oppressive, and yet there was a strange feeling beneath it, something that prickled at the edges of her awareness. A sensation of being watched. She forced herself to move further inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The sound echoed in the empty space. The foyer stretched out before her, leading into a labyrinth of rooms that she barely remembered. Elena set her bag down on the dusty floor and stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering in from the stained glass windows. It was strange how a place so familiar could feel so alien. The house had an air of stillness about it, as though it had been waiting for something or someone. She wandered the lower floor, her footsteps echoing through the vast empty halls. Everything was just as her aunt had left it, preserved in a state of forgotten neglect. Heavy drapes hung from the windows, blocking out what little light there was. Dust clung to every surface, undisturbed for what seemed like years. The house had the smell of old wood and dampness, a smell that settled into her lungs and made the air feel thick. Elena found herself standing in the grand parlor, staring at the massive fireplace that dominated the room. The hearth was cold, its ashes long dead, but she could almost imagine the fire that had once burned there, crackling with life, casting shadows on the walls. She had sat here once, a small girl, her aunt sitting across from her, silent and severe. Even then, she had felt the weight of the house pressing down on her, its whispers curling at the edges of her mind. And then, as if on cue, she heard it. A whisper, soft, barely audible, like the rustle of fabric in the wind. It came from somewhere deep within the house, so faint she thought she might have imagined it. But it came again, this time closer, drifting through the air like a forgotten memory. Elena, her breath hitched in her throat. She spun around, eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing. No one. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, as though the house itself were holding its breath. She stood there for a long time, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the whisper, if it had ever been real, did not return. Elena swallowed hard and forced herself to move. It was just the wind, she told herself, just the wind in an old, empty house. But as she made her way upstairs to the master bedroom, the uneasy feeling settled deeper into her bones. That night, as she lay in bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, she could still hear the faintest echo of the whisper in the back of her mind. Elena. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by the creaking of the house, the shifting of shadows, and the sensation of unseen eyes watching from the corners of the room. She told herself it was nothing, just the old house settling around her. But in the darkness, the whisper lingered, threading through her dreams like a shadow she could never quite catch. And the house, as always, waited. The morning light did little to ease the tension that had coiled in Elena's chest. She awoke with the memory of whispers still clinging to her mind, their echoes chasing her from her restless sleep into the cold light of day. The house was silent now, but it felt like the kind of silence that hummed beneath the surface, as though it was waiting for the right moment to speak again. Determined to push away the unease, Elena spent the morning exploring more of the house, hoping that the daylight would strip away some of the darkness that had settled in her mind. But even in the morning light, Raven House felt oppressive. The long hallways, lined with portraits of long-dead ancestors, seemed to close in on her. The faces in the paintings stared down at her with hollow eyes, their expressions frozen in grim disapproval. She paused in front of one of the portraits, an imposing figure of a woman in a black dress with a high collar. Her eyes seemed to follow Elena as she moved, the expression on her pale face unreadable. She recognized the woman as her great-grandmother, a matriarch of the Graves family who had been dead for decades. There was something unsettling about the portrait, as if the woman had been caught mid-breath, waiting for something that never came. A faint shiver ran down Elena's spine, and she quickly moved on, feeling those eyes boring into her back as she walked down the corridor. The day passed slowly, each room a dusty, forgotten time capsule of her family's history. She spent hours sorting through old papers and yellowed letters, most of them mundane records of daily life that felt impossibly distant from her own. The house was filled with the relics of a life she had never truly known, pieces of a family history she had been kept at arm's length from. By mid-afternoon, she found herself in the attic. The air was thick with dust, the beams overhead groaning as if the weight of the house bore down on them. The small, circular window at the far end of the room let in a pale sliver of light, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. Old trunks and forgotten furniture lay haphazardly around the room, their shapes looming like dark figures in the dim light. As she rifled through an old chest, she found it, her aunt's journal. It was tucked away beneath a pile of moth-eaten linens, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. Elena's hands trembled as she lifted it from the chest, the air around her growing impossibly still. She hadn't expected to find something so personal, so intimate. Her aunt had always been a private, secretive woman, keeping her thoughts and feelings hidden behind a cold, impenetrable exterior. The idea of her confiding in a journal felt almost wrong, like Elena was trespassing on something that wasn't meant to be seen. But curiosity got the better of her. She sat on the old wooden floor, cross-legged, and opened the journal. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and filled with a cramped, shaky handwriting that seemed to grow more erratic as the entries went on. The early pages were filled with mundane details, notes on the weather, complaints about the state of the house, and vague mentions of loneliness. But as she flipped further into the journal, the tone shifted. The writing became more frantic, the letters jagged and uneven, as if her aunt had been writing in haste, desperate to put something down before it slipped away. August 5th. The whispers have returned. I hear them in the walls at night, faint at first, but growing louder. They call to me, tugging at my mind. I try to ignore them, but it is impossible. They know my name. They know my thoughts. They watch me. The house is alive with them. I fear I am not alone here anymore. August 12th. I saw it again today, a shadow, just out of the corner of my eye, watching me from the end of the hallway. When I turned, it was gone, but I know what I saw. I am not losing my mind. The house, it wants something from me, but I cannot leave. I cannot leave it alone with its whispers. September 2nd. The dreams. They are becoming worse. Every night I walk through the house in my sleep, my feet moving of their own accord. I wander the halls, lost, searching for something I cannot name. And always the shadows are there, following me, watching from the corners of my vision. Last night I found myself in the basement. I don't know how I got there, but when I woke, There were footprints in the dust. They were not mine. Elena felt her heart begin to race as she read the last entry. The words seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like they had been written in a state of delirium. She could almost feel the desperation in the scrawled handwriting, the fear that had clearly consumed her aunt in her final days. But what disturbed her most was the growing sense of familiarity in the words. The whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. They were the same things Elena had been experiencing since she arrived at the house. She had tried to dismiss them as her imagination, but now, as she read her aunt's words, she couldn't help but feel that something more sinister was at play. Had her aunt gone mad, driven to the brink by loneliness and isolation? Or had the house truly come alive, feeding on her fears, whispering to her in the dead of night? The air in the attic felt suddenly suffocating, thick with the weight of old secrets. Elena closed the journal and held it tightly in her hands, her pulse racing. She could hear the faint creaking of the house around her, the floorboards groaning as if something were shifting beneath the surface. She rose to her feet, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest, and made her way back down to the main floor. But no matter how hard she tried to push the thoughts from her mind, the words from the journal lingered. The house remembers. The house whispers. The house watches. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unease, the journal weighing heavily on her mind. By evening, the sense of dread had only grown stronger, pressing down on her like an invisible hand. The house felt more alive than ever. The creaking of the floorboards, the groaning of the walls, all seemed to speak to her in a language she couldn't understand. That night, Elena's dreams were vivid and strange. She found herself wandering the halls of Raven House, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floors. The house was dark, the shadows thicker than they should have been, wrapping around her like a cloak. She moved through the house as if in a trance, her mind foggy, her body heavy. She passed through rooms she didn't remember ever seeing before, rooms filled with strange old furniture, covered in sheets that billowed as she walked by. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew, and she could hear the faintest whispering just at the edge of her hearing. "Elena!" She stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a cold wave of fear washing over her. She turned, searching the darkness, but saw nothing. "Elena!" The whisper came again, closer this time, more insistent. She could feel eyes on her, unseen but watching from the shadows. She tried to move, to turn and run, but her feet wouldn't obey. She was rooted to the spot, frozen in place as the whispering grew louder until it was all around her, echoing through the halls of the house. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her like a weight. She felt something cold brush against her arm, and she gasped, spinning around. But there was nothing there, just the empty, darkened hallway. She woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was cold, the air heavy with a damp chill. She sat up in bed, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to shake off the lingering fear. But even in the safety of her bedroom, she could still feel it. That strange, oppressive presence that had haunted her dreams. The house was watching her. It had always been watching her. And the whispers she knew were far from over. Days stretched into nights in Raven House, each one blending into the next with an unsettling rhythm. Elena found herself drifting through the mansion like a ghost, the weight of her aunt's journal heavy in her mind. she had tried to distract herself by focusing on practical matters, organizing her aunt's affairs, sorting through the mountain of paperwork left behind. But no amount of work could banish the whispers that lingered in the corners of her mind. The nights were the worst. Each time she closed her eyes, the dreams came back. Dark hallways, endless doors, a sensation of being led deeper into the house by an unseen hand, her movements no longer her own. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent, until they filled her mind with a cacophony of voices she could not understand. But it wasn't just the dreams. During the day, the shadows in the house seemed to shift and move of their own accord. Every time she turned a corner or entered a room, it felt as if something had just left. Some presence that had been watching her, following her, waiting for her to look away. The creaks and groans of the old house had taken on a sinister tone, as though the very walls were alive with hidden intent. Something was wrong with Raven House, deeply, unnervingly wrong. And Elena knew she could no longer ignore it. The more she tried to piece together her aunt's final days, the more her thoughts returned to the journal and its cryptic ramblings. The idea that the house itself was somehow sentient, that it could think, feel, and manipulate those who lived within it, was absurd. And yet, every day she felt more certain that her aunt had not been mad. The whispers, the shadows, the way the house seemed to breathe and watch, they were real. And if she stayed here much longer, they would consume her too. Desperate for answers, Elena decided to confront the house's history head-on. She needed to understand what had happened to her aunt, and by extension, what was happening to her. There had to be something in the town's records, something that explained the strange hold Raven House had over her family. She drove into the village the next morning, the fog thick and oppressive, clinging to the windshield like a warning. The Crowbridge Town archives were housed in a small, crumbling building that smelled of old paper and mildew. The elderly archivist eyed her warily as she entered, but said nothing as she requested access to records on her family. She spent hours combing through faded birth and death certificates, marriage records, and old news clippings. The Graves family had been a fixture in Crowbridge for generations, but their history was littered with tragedy. As she dug deeper, Elena began to notice a disturbing pattern. Many of her ancestors had died young, under strange and sometimes violent circumstances. Her great-grandfather had been found hanging in the attic of Raven House. His death ruled a suicide, though no one could explain why he would have done it. Her great-aunt had disappeared one night, leaving behind nothing but a smear of blood on the floor of her bedroom. Her own mother had died in Raven House when Elena was just a child, an apparent fall down the stairs that had always struck her as suspicious, though no one had ever questioned it. But it wasn't just the deaths. There were whispers of madness, too. Several family members had been institutionalized, their minds unraveling under the weight of unseen pressures. One great-uncle had been found wandering the streets of Crowbridge, muttering incoherently about shadows and voices. He had been committed to an asylum shortly thereafter, where he died not long after. Elena's hands shook as she leafed through the records. The connection was undeniable. Raven House had claimed them all, one by one, and now it had its sights set on her. She returned to the mansion that evening with a growing sense of dread. The house loomed in the distance as she approached, its dark silhouette barely visible through the thickening fog. It felt more imposing than ever, as though it had been waiting for her to return. The air around it seemed to hum with a low, dark energy, and Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, its many windows like eyes that followed her every movement. That night, she could no longer ignore the pull of the house's deepest, darkest places. Her dreams had been leading her there for days, and now the whispers seemed to echo in her mind even when she was awake, urging her to descend further into the bowels of the mansion. She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and made her way down to the basement. The door groaned on its rusted hinges as she opened it, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. A cold draft seeped up from below, carrying with it the smell of damp stone and something else, something ancient and musty, like the scent of decay left too long to fester. Elena hesitated at the top of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But she couldn't. Not now. She needed to know the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. The stairs creaked beneath her weight as she descended, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was cold and damp, the walls slick with moisture. Old furniture lay scattered around the room, draped in moldy sheets, and the floor was littered with debris. But none of that was what held Elena's attention. At the far end of the basement was a door she had never seen before. It was old and weathered, its surface covered in strange, faded symbols that looked almost like runes. Her pulse quickened as she approached, the whispers growing louder in her mind. She reached out and touched the door, feeling a strange warmth radiating from it, as though something alive pulsed just beyond it. The handle was cold beneath her fingers as she turned it, the door swinging open with a low groan. Beyond it was a narrow stone passageway that descended even further underground. The air here was thick and heavy, almost suffocating, and Elena could feel the weight of it pressing down on her as she stepped inside. The passage led to a large, circular chamber deep beneath the house. The walls were lined with strange symbols, similar to the ones on the door. But these were fresher, almost as if they had been carved recently. At the center of the chamber stood an ancient altar, its surface stained dark with something that might have been blood. But it was the figure at the center of the room that held her attention. It was a grotesque statue, carved from black stone, its form twisted and nightmarish. The figure had too many eyes, all of them staring in different directions, and its limbs were impossibly long, coiled around its body in a way that defied reason. Elena felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she stared at it, her skin crawling with an unnatural fear. This was the source of it. The whispers, the shadows, the madness. It all came from here. This ancient, malevolent force had been buried beneath Raven House for centuries, feeding off the fears and despair of those who lived above it. The house had been built not as a home, but as a prison to contain this dark entity, to keep it sealed away from the world. But over time, the prison had weakened. The entity had seeped into the house, into the minds of Elena's ancestors, driving them to madness and death. And now it was reaching for her. The whispers filled her mind louder than ever, speaking in a language she couldn't understand but could feel deep in her bones. The statue seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though it was alive, its many eyes flickering with an unnatural light. Elena could feel it drawing her in, pulling at her mind, tugging at her thoughts. She stumbled back, her head swimming with confusion and fear. She had to get out. She had to escape before it claimed her, just as it had claimed the others. But as she turned to flee, she heard it. A voice, soft and insistent, cutting through the whispers. "Elena!" She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was the same voice from her dreams, the same voice that had been haunting her since she arrived at the house. But now it was clearer, more distinct. "Elena, don't run. Stay." Her legs felt like lead, her body unwilling to obey her mind's commands. The voice was so familiar, so close, and yet she couldn't place it. It called to her, pulling her deeper into the darkness, wrapping around her like a cold embrace. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the chamber, half hidden in shadow. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. But its eyes were the same as those in her dreams, glowing with a pale, unnatural light. "Elena, come closer." She wanted to scream, to run, to flee this place and never look back. But she couldn't. The house had her now, its grip tightening around her mind like a vice. And as the figure stepped forward, its voice echoing in the chamber, Elena realized with dawning horror that she was no longer in control. The house had always been alive, and now it had finally claimed her. The darkness had weight now. It pressed against Elena's skin, coiling around her like smoke, thick and impenetrable. The air in Raven House felt heavy, each breath a struggle, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. The whispers never stopped anymore. They filled every room, every corner, every space. They weren't just inside the house, they were inside her. She no longer knew how many days had passed since she found the chamber beneath the house. Time had begun to lose its meaning, stretching out in strange, elastic loops, each moment blurring into the next. She wandered the halls at night, unable to sleep, her footsteps echoing softly in the oppressive silence. She barely recognized herself in the cracked mirrors that lined the house. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and gaunt, her hair a tangled mess that she no longer cared to brush. She was losing herself. The house was stripping her away, piece by piece, devouring her soul just as it had devoured those who came before her. But she couldn't leave. Not now. The house had tethered itself to her mind, binding her to its rotting heart. Every time she thought of fleeing, of throwing open the front door and running into the fog-shrouded night, something pulled her back. It was the voice, always the voice. It whispered to her in soft, seductive tones, promising answers, promising peace. All she had to do was listen. She didn't know how much longer she could resist. The madness was seeping into her mind, crawling through her thoughts like insects burrowing beneath her skin. She scratched at her arms, her nails leaving red marks that she barely felt, her mind fraying at the edges. The shadows danced at the periphery of her vision, moving with a life of their own, always watching, always waiting. The house wanted her, and it was growing impatient. That night, the whispers grew louder. They surged through the house like a storm, swirling around her as she paced the hallways, their voices rising and falling in a twisted symphony of madness. They were no longer content to stay hidden in the shadows. They were all around her now, tangible, pressing against her with a suffocating intensity. "Elena!" The voice was there again, soft and insistent, cutting through the chorus of whispers. She stopped in her tracks, her heart racing in her chest. The voice was closer now, so close she could almost feel the breath of it against her ear. "Elena, come." Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her down the hallway toward the grand staircase. The house seemed to breathe around her, its walls pulsing with a strange energy, its shadows twisting into grotesque shapes that loomed over her like specters. She descended the stairs slowly, her hands gripping the banister as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. The voice led her deeper into the house, through corridors she had never seen before, their walls lined with peeling wallpaper and rotting wood. The air grew colder as she moved, her breath fogging in the chill, her skin prickling with a deep, unnatural cold. She didn't question where she was going. The voice guided her, pulling her along like a puppet on strings. Finally, she reached the door. It was the same door she had found in the basement, the one marked with strange, faded symbols that she now understood were wards, ancient protections meant to keep something locked away. But the wards were broken, their power long since faded. Whatever had been imprisoned here was no longer contained. She opened the door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The chamber was as she remembered it, cold and dark, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. The walls were lined with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light, and at the center of the room stood the grotesque statue, the twisted figure with too many eyes and coiled limbs. But it was no longer just a statue. It pulsed with life, its surface shifting and writhing as though something beneath it was struggling to break free. The whispers filled the chamber, louder now, overwhelming, a cacophony of voices that echoed in her mind. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block them out, but it was useless. The whispers were inside her head, burrowing deeper, forcing her to listen. "Elena, you are the last." She stumbled forward, her legs weak, her mind reeling. The voice was no longer distant. It was everywhere, surrounding her, consuming her. She could feel it pressing against her skin, sliding into her thoughts, coiling around her soul. "Elena, release us." Tears streamed down her face as she stood before the statue, her hands trembling at her sides. She could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on her, the despair of all those who had come before her, those who had been trapped in this house, consumed by its darkness. She could feel their fear, their madness, their deaths, all of it coursing through her veins like poison. She couldn't fight it anymore. The house had broken her, torn her apart, and now there was nothing left but the whispers. They had become her reality. They were the only thing she could hear, the only thing she could feel. With trembling hands, she reached out to the statue. As her fingers brushed its cold surface, a surge of energy shot through her, knocking her back. The chamber seemed to tilt, the walls closing in, the shadows swirling faster and faster until they became a black void, pulling her into their depths. The whispers grew louder, a deafening roar that filled her mind, drowning out everything else. "Elena, we are one." She screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed through the chamber, but it was swallowed by the darkness. She could feel the entity wrapping itself around her, pulling her down, deeper and deeper into the void. It was inside her now, its presence flooding her mind, filling every corner of her consciousness. And then, suddenly, there was silence. Elena opened her eyes. She was standing in the grand foyer of Raven House. The darkness was gone. The whispers were gone. Everything was still. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare, that she had finally woken up from the madness that had consumed her. But as she looked around, she realized something was wrong. The house was too quiet, too still, and then she saw it. Her reflection in the mirror across the room. It wasn't Her. The figure in the mirror looked like her, but its eyes were wrong. They were dark, empty voids, filled with something ancient and malevolent. It stared back at her with a cold, knowing smile, its lips curling into a twisted grin that made her stomach churn. "Elena," the voice whispered, but this time it wasn't coming from inside her mind. It was coming from the reflection. She stepped back, her heart racing, but the reflection didn't move. It remained still, smiling that awful smile, its dark eyes gleaming with a terrible hunger. The realization hit her like a blow. She was no longer in control. The house had taken her. The entity had taken her. She was trapped inside her own body, a prisoner in her own mind, watching helplessly as the thing that wore her face began to move, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "Elena," the voice whispered again, and this time it was filled with dark amusement. "We are home," she screamed, but no sound came out. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The reflection watched her with cruel delight as she struggled, her mind unraveling, her soul sinking deeper into the abyss. And as the thing wearing her face turned away from the mirror and began to ascend the stairs, Elena realized the terrible truth. She was never leaving Raven House. Not ever. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed all those before her. It had taken her mind, her soul, her very essence, and there was nothing left of her but a hollow shell, a puppet for the entity that had been waiting in the darkness for so long. As the whispers began again, soft and insidious, Elena's final thought flickered through the remnants of her shattered mind. She was no longer afraid of the dark. She was the dark.